Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. Very good to have you all here with me this week as we discuss the counterattack and redemption arc of Thorin Oakenshield, King under the mountain at last. We discuss, of course, the coming of the Eagles and then the aftermath of the Battle of the Five Armies as we look at the end of Chapter 17 and all of Chapter 18 of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. We are drawing now very close to the end of the book, very close to the end of the year. Announcements coming up at the end of the show about what we are going to do next, or at least a range of possible things that we might do next. The true decision, the final judgment, is of course up to all of you. That is the doom that you must deem. More on that later. Good evening to Austin and to Brian and to Chris here in the chat. It is good to have you all here. I am glad to be back. If you've been keeping up with my other shows, or rather the absence of my other shows, you will know that I have in fact been sick for much of the last week, and it feels like a minute since I sat down to do this show. So it's good to be back, I guess, though it feels a little Groundhog Day-y at this point, though that is, of course, temporarily inappropriate. Let's get into our discussion tonight as we look at a reading which is as defined by what is occluded than what is evident on the page. There are many significant things that we are going to discuss in the course of this week's reading which are just absent from the narrative report that is delivered to us. More a narrative report in this part of the book than at any other since the very beginning, of course, as we shift even out of Bilbo's POV, out into that narrative voice that we've discussed so often. We're going to get a gloss of the future history, if you will, of this part of Middle-earth, and we'll see exactly how many of the moving pieces of the plot of The Hobbit come to rest at last. Before we get to all of that, though, we really do have to wrap up the Battle of the Five Armies. We've got 2 slides in which to do so. And we're going to begin with, well, one of those things which happens off screen, one of those things which is reported to us. Actually, not even reported to us, right? This is left for our inference. We are supposed to find within Thorin's decision to sally forth from the Lonely Mountain in support of the allied troops of the Battle of Five Armies. We're supposed to find within that a redemption, a rejection of the dragon sickness, a rejection of his own selfishness, his own jealousy. Here, there is a moment of self-sacrifice. Let's look at the, Brian is tempting me, Stars and Swords bonus Groundhog Day. Wow, I mean, I love Groundhog Day. I don't know how much there is left to do with Groundhog Day. And I say that as someone who podcasts about Professor Tolkien's work. So I'm a part of the critical industrial machinery of the internet. I'm sometimes very conscious of the fact that, there are 90 podcasts out there doing the kind of work that I am doing right now. So I don't know that there's a great deal left to be said about Groundhog Day, but it is a great movie. Actually, there is more to be said about Groundhog Day than many other films just because of the development of that script and what is intended behind that script. The whole idea that it is a kind of broadly Buddhist parable, that it is much more ambitious in its initial intent and then becomes scaled back in the production machinery of that film. It's a lot to consider, I suppose. A lot of speculative material. Let's get into our slides for discussion tonight then, beginning with, as I say, the Battle of the Five Armies. Here we are. Day drew on. The goblins gathered again in the valley. There a host of wargs came ravening, and with them came the bodyguard of Bolg, goblins of huge size with scimitars of steel. Soon actual darkness was coming into a stormy sky, while still the great bats swirled about the heads and ears of elves and men, or fastened vampire-like on the stricken. Now Bard was fighting to defend the eastern spur, and yet giving slowly back, and the elf lords were at bay about their king upon the southern arm, near to the watchpost on Raven Hill. Suddenly there was a great shout, and from the gate came a trumpet call. They had forgotten Thorin. Part of the wall, moved by levers, fell outward with a crash into the pool. Out leapt the king under the mountain, and his companions followed him. Hood and cloak were gone. They were in shining armor, and red light leapt from their eyes. In the gloom the great dwarf gleamed like gold in a dying fire. Rocks were hurled down from on high by the goblins above, but they held on, leapt down to the fall's foot, and rushed forward to battle. Wolf and rider fell or fled before them. Thorin wielded his axe with mighty strokes, and nothing seemed to harm him. To me, elves and men, to me, O my kinsfolk, he cried, and his voice shook like a horn in the valley. So, as I say, on the one hand, on the level of superficial reading, on the level of movement of plot, on the level of events within this book, this is just awesome, right? We have the fragmentary battle. We even get this schematic, a rare schematic that Tolkien gives us of how the battle is unfolding. We get the idea that there are different battlefronts developing, that Bard is occupied here on the eastern spur, while the elf lords were at bay about their king upon the southern arm near to the watchpost on Ravenhill, right? We get the idea that the allies are split, that they are becoming overwhelmed, that they are becoming swarmed. We have the bats coming down. Another example here of the bats being vampire-like, right? I've mentioned before many times that vampire to Tolkien means only bats. It does not mean, your average common or garden Draculas. There's not so much of that in Tolkien's work, but here we get the explicit connection here. The bats are fastened vampire-like on the stricken, right? This horrifying idea. And then Thorin. And of course, Austin's pointing out, gloom and gleam, still one of my favorite alliterations. There's so much good here, right? The breaking down. You'll remember the wall that has been erected across the gate is this stone wall that has been crafted. It is not a gate anymore, as much as it is a wall. In fact, kind of defining Thorin's relationship with the outside world as he's barricading himself into the mountain. And they bring it down with levers, which I don't take to be some clever Tomb Raider-esque or Indiana Jones-esque, ancient machinery, a Jacksonian flourish, I'm sure, but rather just the application of gigantic levers behind the wall that cause the whole thing to topple when adequate force is applied. So the wall falls and out leaps the king under the mountain. You'll notice the proper title being given to Thorin Oakenshield in this moment, because in this moment, more than ever before, he is the king under the mountain. His companions follow him. Hood and cloak are gone. The guise that they were wearing, the raiment of their previous lives, right? The domestic world, almost domestic world, into which they were forced following the diaspora of the population of Erebor following Smaug's attack. All of that is gone. They are now as they were meant to be, in shining armor, red light leaping from their eyes, and we get the direct reference here. If red light isn't enough to summon forth the metaphor, we get the evocation of Smaug's fire here. In the gloom, the great dwarf gleamed like gold in a dying fire. Because in a very real sense, he is like unto gold in a dying fire. So they make their way to the foot of the waterfall and beset the enemy, beset their foes. But more than that, Thorin calls out. This isn't just vengeance, right? This isn't just battle fury taking the dwarves. This isn't even a desire to only aid the dwarves of the Iron Hills who have come to assist them. Thorin immediately calls out to everyone, to me, elves and men, to me, O my kinsfolk. And his voice is given that quality that great voices are given in Tolkien's work, to ring like a horn in the valley. This is an unambiguously heroic moment. And it's a little puzzling, because we have no idea how he gets there. There is no emotional arc here, and it is emblematic of one of the ways in which Professor Tolkien writes according to a completely different literary sensibility than basically any modern author. And the modern authors who are writing like Tolkien now are doing so because they are deliberately aping Tolkien, right? There's no one out there who is writing fantasy that is this authentically rooted. I'm saying that very broadly and dismissively. Perhaps there are, in fact, writers out there who are drawing on these medieval traditions, drawing on these Anglo-Saxon traditions, drawing on these Norse and Germanic traditions to write exactly the kinds of stories that Professor Tolkien is writing here. But what he's not doing is giving in to modern writer advice. He's not making everyone the hero of their own story. He's not giving everyone a narrative arc. We're not getting a satisfying emotional turn for Thorin Oakenshield here. It all happens off screen. It happens by implication. We can see the proof of it, but not the moment of it. We don't know what conversations are had behind the barricade. We don't know what Thorin says to Fili, to Kili, to Bomber, right? Who you remember is a dissenting voice in the barricading of Erebor in the moment. Austin observes here in the chat, he truly becomes the king in that moment. When Hearth and home are threatened, he finds the strength to cast off the dragon sickness. Right, I think you're completely right, Austin. But in so doing, in the recognition of that moment, right, it is a danger to him, but it is also inclusive of those who are his allies. It is a real enemy of my enemy moment here, as he calls out first to elves and men, and then to his kinsfolk. It is clear that his purpose is to unite the three, quote unquote, I say this very hesitantly, good armies of the five who are battling here. And it is interesting that we don't see what happens exactly and that it is left for our inference, but it is also crucial that it happens. We're going to be talking a lot about how we end character arcs, how we resolve internal character tensions as we move through this week's reading, because frankly, we're at the end of the book and that's what's left to do, right? We're going to be talking a lot about what happens to Dain and what happens to Thranduil and what happens to Bard and what happens to Bilbo, how he resolves his own internal tension. And though Thorin's happens off screen, it is a truly heroic moment. And I find it extremely inspiring, with all that evocation of Smaug's fire, with all that evocation of the gold of the mountain, right? The coming forth of the king under the mountain. Extremely effective stuff. Let's take a look at our last slide of chapter 17 then. And as we foreshadowed last week, the moment of greatest eucatastrophe, though we must recognize a moment in a chain of eucatastrophes, not even the last moment in the chain of eucatastrophes, right? We're going to talk about that in just a moment too, when we get to the précis of the battle presented to us after the fact. The eagles are important, are pivotal, but are neither the cause of this victory or the agents of that victory, the direct and sole agents of that victory. We'll talk about that when we get there, but for now, the eagles are coming. On all this, Bilbo looked with misery. He had taken his stand on Raven Hill among the elves, partly because there was more chance of escape from that point, and partly, with the more tookish part of his mind, because if he was going to be in a last desperate stand, he preferred on the whole to defend the Elven King. Gandalf, too, I may say, was there, sitting on the ground as if in deep thought, preparing, I suppose, some last blast of magic before the end. That did not seem far off. It will not be long now, thought Bilbo, before the goblins win the gate and we are all slaughtered or driven down and captured. Really, it is enough to make one weep after all one has gone through. I would rather old Smaug had been left with all the wretched treasure than these vile creatures should get it, and poor old Bomber and Balin and Fili and Keely and all the rest come to a bad end, and Bard, too, and the Lake Man and the merry elves. Misery me! I have heard stories of many battles, and I have always understood that defeat may be glorious. It seems very uncomfortable, not to say distressing. I wish I was well out of it. The clouds were torn by the wind, and a red sunset slashed the west. Suddenly, seeing the sudden gleam in the gloom, Bilbo looked around. He gave a great cry. He had seen a sight that made his heart leap, dark shapes, small yet majestic against the distant glow. "The eagles! The eagles!" he shouted. "The eagles are coming!" Bilbo's eyes were seldom wrong. The eagles were coming down the wind, line after line, in such a host as must have gathered from all the eyries of the north. "The eagles! The eagles!" Bilbo cried, dancing and waving his arms. If the elves could not see him, they could hear him. Soon they, too, took up the cry, and it echoed across the valley. Many wondering eyes looked up, though as yet nothing could be seen except from the southern shoulders, of the mountain. "The eagles!" cried Bilbo once more, but at that moment a stone hurtling from above smote heavily on his helm, and he fell with a crash and knew no more. The eagles are coming. The eagles are here. It has happened. We will find out, of course, that they have, in fact, emptied all the eyries of the north, that they have marshaled a force here, the closest thing that we see from the eagles to a military force, to come and enter into the battle. But what is more important in this moment is the succession, I suppose. Right? We will position the eagles in the midst of the succession of unexpected assistance. First, we have Thorin bursting forth. I suppose, first we have the arrival of the goblin army that forces the alliance between men and elves and the dwarves of the Iron Hills, right? That's our first kind of eucatastrophic swing in that second. Then we have the arrival of Thorin through the gate, also wading into the fray. A small force, for sure, but a rallying force, a rallying presence, a real authority on the battlefield. Then we have the eagles coming in, and we'll get to Beorn in just a moment. But this is the one that is referred to as the greatest eucatastrophe because it is also tied to the primary symbolic infrastructure of Tolkien's Legendarium. They come out of the west. They are the eagles themselves, right? We get the gleam in the gloom, which is, again, repeating that same beat from the last slide. We're really leaning into the Anglo-Saxon alliterative verse style that Tolkien adopts sometimes in these more dramatic, more important, more significant moments. And we get that here again. Seeing the sudden gloom in the gleam, Bilbo looked around. So they are not just coming out of the west, but are heralded. The red sunset slashes the west because the clouds are torn by wind. And it's impossible to read this. I remember back at the beginning of the series, I said we were going to read the Hobbit, through the prism of the Silmarillion and try to match all of this up. And that's been largely a fruitless exercise because there just isn't really that much Silmarillion in the Hobbit when you get right down to it. And what there is co-opted and rewritten and kind of adapted into itself after the fact with the writing of the Lord of the Rings. But here we get something that is pure, uncut Silmarillion. This is pure, uncut Elder Days, right? The wind that rents the cloud and the eagles coming from the west. These are the envoys of Manwë. These are the arm of the Valar reaching forth. They're not, of course, technically, in the pages of The Hobbit, they're not, but when you read The Hobbit in its place, in its compositional place, I suppose, in its compositional spot in the chronology, it's easy to understand what Tolkien is referencing here. And then we get another classic Bilbo moment, right when the battle is getting important, right when it's getting good. He's knocked out. And why is he knocked out? Well, politely, he takes the first half of this slide to explain it to us. Tolkien takes the first half of this slide to explain it to us, which is simply that Bilbo is ill-suited for this. He just doesn't quite fit this world. He doesn't completely fail to fit the world. One of the things that I adore most about this part of the book is this very brief beat where Bilbo acknowledges, with the more Tookish part of his mind, that if he's going to fall in battle, he would rather fall in the service of the Elven King, with whom he has a pretty tough relationship. Let's be honest, right? He's spent these untold weeks within the halls of the Elven King, pilfering bread here, wine there, a little cheese here. He's had this experience, his experience of the Elven King's hospitality, of course, also influenced by the fact that the Elven King took all of his companions prisoner and kept them all locked up in that place. But there is something about the Elven King. There is something about the figure of Thranduil, though he is unnamed in this book, that inspires a certain awe. And again, we were talking a little last week about Thranduil being reset by the death of Smaug, in effect, right? When the narrative pivots back to him, it's like he is a different dude. And I think we're seeing that version of him here too. For all that he is feeling Baggins-ish now, right? There is this small Tookish part of his mind, but he's having a very Baggins-ish response to warfare. It is enough to make one weep after all one has gone through. I would rather that old Smaug can be left with the wretched treasure than that these vile creatures should get it, right? And that everyone should suffer. That's what he's most concerned about. But in this moment, he is still Bilbo of the Shire who likes to take long walks and to think about elves, right? We're seeing that kind of that connection between the hobbits and their version of the natural world and the elves and their version of the natural world, which will be absolutely front and center when we get to The Lord of the Rings. This is clearly a shared kind of conception here. So the eagles come, and Bilbo is knocked out, and we get the chapter transition. And what I love so much about this, many of Tolkien's chapters are flatly descriptive, right? Riddles in the dark, for example, or they are directly metaphorical. They are metaphorical in a way that is evident, that is easy to parse, out of the frying pan and into the fire, or, the clouds burst, the previous chapter. But chapter 18 is just the return home. And to turn the page and see there, chapter 18, the return home, is perhaps a bit of a surprise, given that we are now in the middle of the Battle of Five Armies. But as it turns out, Bilbo has been knocked unconscious. Bilbo is wearing the ring and has been overlooked until he wakes on the hillside later in the day. In fact, in the original draft, let me call up our next slide here. In the original draft, he wakes at dawn and kind of gathers himself in that moment. But here it's much later in the day. A cloudless day, but cold, was broad above him, right? We're way out of the dawn hours here. It's been a long, long time. When Bilbo came to himself, he was literally by himself. He was lying on the flat stones of Raven Hill and no one was near. A cloudless day but cold was broad over him. He was shaking and as chilled as stone, but his head burned with fire. Now I wonder what has happened, he said to himself. At any rate, I am not yet one of the fallen heroes, but I suppose there is still time enough for that. He sat up painfully. Looking into the valley, he could see no living goblins. After a while, as his head cleared a little, he thought he could see elves moving in the rocks below. He rubbed his eyes. Surely there was a camp still in the plain some distance off, but there was a coming and going about the gate. Dwarves seemed to be busy removing the wall, but all was deadly still. There was no call and no echo of song. Sorrow seemed to be in the air. Victory after all, I suppose, he said, feeling his aching head. Well, it seems a very gloomy business. So, awaking into the aftermath here and finding himself, the thing that jumps out at you, of course, is that Bilbo does not know that he is wearing the ring, which is incompatible with our Jacksonian vision of how the ring operates. But I also don't know how you would parse that necessarily at this point in the story, right? Very difficult to get to a ring that is experiential and cinematic in the way that the ring has to be, but can also be completely ignored by the wearer of the ring. Nonetheless, he wakes invisible on the hillside, cold, his head blazing after being struck by the rock, and sees this paradox. He sees the camp in the valley. He sees bustling about the gate. He sees the deconstruction of the wall, and yet the stillness, the silence, the sorrow. Bilbo is once again in a position where he is acting as audience surrogate. This is the reason that he gets knocked out at the end of the previous chapter. It's not just that we want to spare Bilbo the horrors of war. It's that we want to put him in a position where he can once again ask the right questions, where he can once again be our POV character without the narrative voice having to intrude. And what's most interesting about this chapter, I think, is where the narrative voice comes in and where it comes out, where we are left for Bilbo to instruct, in effect. Bilbo is then carried back to camp by the person who finds him. Originally, again, in the first draft of the manuscript, he is supposed to be found by an eagle. He is supposed to be found by, in fact, the eagle that carried him to the Carrack way back when. Just a coincidence in that moment. But instead, he is found by what is, I would say, the most significant unnamed character in this book. Is that possible? Is this guy the most unnamed and untitled, right? Technically, the Elven King is unnamed. The Master of Lake Town is unnamed. The Captain of the Elven King's Guard is unnamed, but they all have titles, at least. This guy gets nothing. He's just there to swiftly ferry Bilbo back down the mountainside so that we can get to the turning point in this week's reading. And I think pretty unambiguously, I mean, we can do a show of hands here in the chat, but I'm fairly certain that this is everyone's favorite passage from The Hobbit. This is Thorin's death scene, of course. When Gandalf saw Bilbo, he was delighted. "Baggins!" he exclaimed. "Well, I never. Alive, after all, I am glad. I began to wonder if even your luck would see you through. A terrible business, and it nearly was disastrous. But other news can wait. Come," he said more gravely. "You are called for." And leading the Hobbit, he took him within the tent. "Hail, Thorin," he said as he entered. "I have brought him." There indeed lay Thorin Oakenshield, wounded with many wounds, and his rent armor and notched axe were cast upon the floor. He looked up as Bilbo came beside him. "Farewell, good thief," he said. "I go now to the halls of waiting to sit beside my fathers until the world is renewed. Since I leave now all gold and silver and go where it is of little worth, I wish to part in friendship from you, and I would take back my words and deeds at the gate." Bilbo knelt on one knee, filled with sorrow. "Farewell, King under the mountain," he said. "This is a bitter adventure if it must end so, and not a mountain of gold can amend it. Yet I am glad I have shared in your perils. That has been more than any Baggins deserves." "No," said Thorin. "There is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. Some courage and some wisdom, blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell." Then Bilbo turned away, and he went by himself, and he sat alone, wrapped in a blanket. And whether you believe it or not, he wept until his eyes were red and his voice was hoarse. He was a kindly little soul. Indeed, it was long before he had the heart to make a joke again. "A mercy it is," he said at last to himself, "that I woke up when I did. I wish Thorin were living, but I'm glad that we parted in kindness. You are a fool, Bilbo Baggins, and you made a great mess of that business with the stone, and there was a battle in spite of all your efforts to buy peace and quiet. But I suppose you can hardly be blamed for that." I've read The Hobbit, God, I don't know, 20 times, 30 times. I have no idea how many times I've read this excerpt, and yet every time, a lump in the throat. It is interesting to begin this with Gandalf. There's a real kind of Gandalf problem here at the end of the story, right? We had that excerpt on the previous slide. Gandalf sitting at Ravenhill, just kind of furiously, probably working on some magic, as we are told by the narrative voice, because there's little to no evidence that, in fact, such magic took place. And here he is. Interestingly, in the original version, actually the typed version of the original handwritten manuscript, Gandalf is standing here with his arm in a sling, having been injured in the battle. That is revised out immediately, but it is a really interesting perspective on who and what Tolkien thought Gandalf was at that point as he's putting this story together. So we have this moment, this what should be a warm reconciliation, and clearly, we get this beat from Gandalf. He seems genuinely delighted that Bilbo, against all odds, is in fact still alive. But what's more important in this moment is Thorin. And you'll note here the detail too. Come, he said more gravely, you are called for. Thorin has been asking for Bilbo prior to his arrival. This is not just a fortuitous happenstance. Thorin has been actively desirous of this outcome. He wants to make peace. He wants to make amends, which absolutely fits with this idea, this implied redemption arc that he has within the Lonely Mountain upon the breakout of open warfare outside his gate. And then, I mentioned at the beginning of this week's session that there are some things that are maybe just over-discussed. There are some things about which maybe everything has been said, and this is perhaps the part of this book that has been most discussed. After the opening sentence, this is arguably the most critically chewed over part of Tolkien's book, and yet it loses none of its narrative power, none of its purpose here. There's so much that we can actually distill out, right? I go now to the holes of, firstly, farewell, good thief. The good thief there is really interesting because Bilbo is called so rarely thief, right? in the context of the book. Favorably, he is referred to as burglar. Thief is generally used as a very, well, the insulting and critical word, in fact, that it really is. But what's lovely here is its repositioning with good, right? Thorin is kind of acknowledging his own wrath the last time that they spoke, the last when he shook Bilbo like a rabbit, as you'll recall, and sent him out to the elves and to the men. I go now to the halls of waiting to sit beside my fathers until the world is renewed, which is a real kind of sucker punch of cosmology right there, right? That is a big lore dump for the Silmarillion, for the Tales of Elder Days there. This is one of the few points where we talk at all about what dwarves think will happen to them after they die, or what they believe that their place is within the created cosmos of Arda. But this seems pretty clear that they are in fact going to go to, if not the halls of Mandos, right, the dwarven version of the halls of Mandos, to wait beside my fathers until the world is renewed, until the final battle, when we are told in the Silmarillion that the dwarves will aid Aule in the recreation of the recreation of Arda, the creation of the new, improved, unmarred Arda. Since I leave now all gold and silver and go where it is of little worth, again acknowledging that he has cast off the dragon sickness, that he has shaken it off somehow, I wish to part in friendship from you, and I would take back my words and deeds at the gate, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, not just, hey, let's put the past behind us, but a real apology. And so Bilbo receives it. This is a bitter adventure if it must end so, not a mountain of gold can amend it. It turns out that the treasure can't fix what really is wrong, which is kind of parallel, at least, to Thorin's argument about giving the treasure, or not giving the treasure, I should say, to the people of Lake Town, right? That the treasure is not Smaug's and therefore should not be employed to amend his evil. But nonetheless, we're going to put it to good use now. And then, of course, the big moment, right? There is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. Now, of course, we're thinking of the Shire. We're going to do a little opposition of East and West when Bilbo makes it back to the Misty Mountains right at the end of this week's reading. We're going to continue to think in terms of the West and the East, the hill and the mountain. We're going to think about this thematic opposition of the two, but reading this in the light of the Silmarillion, reading this in the light of our knowledge of the ancient history of Arda, he is a child of the kindly West, and the West is kindlier than readers of The Hobbit as it is published could possibly imagine, because there is, of course, the inference there of Valinor. Some courage and some wisdom blended in measure, which is often taken to be a textual acknowledgement of the Took and Baggins, right? The courage is the Took side of Bilbo, and the wisdom is the Baggins side. And I'm not 100% sure that I follow that. I'm not, were I compelled under strict urgency to describe the nature of the Baggins in one word, I'm honestly not sure that wisdom is the one that I would choose. There's a coziness, there's a homeliness, there is a domesticity about the Baggins side. It is not exactly a lack of courage, though I do think that courage is perhaps more appropriate for the Tookish side, right? If we're not going to push it as far as recklessness, if we're not going to push it as far as wanderlust, if we're not going to push it as far as a real taste for danger, then I think that courage really works for the Tookish side of his character. But I don't know, wisdom perhaps not the default Baggins-ish quality, at least as I would describe it, but I do get what he is pointing at. And then we get the kicker line. Then we get like the real thing, right? If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world, as true today as it was when Tolkien wrote that line in the first place. Well, actually, Tolkien didn't write that line in the first place. The original edition of The Hobbit has a slightly amended line. Douglas Anderson notes in the annotated Hobbit that this line is changed between the first and second editions. Originally it read, if more men valued food and cheer, but shortly after the publication of the book, Tolkien receives a letter from Arthur Ransome, the author of Swallows and Amazons, the timeless English classic, who points out that the word is used inaccurately. The word men is used inaccurately, or at least inconsistently, several times through the book. He also notes, interestingly, that he doesn't like Gandalf calling the goblins boys and naughty boys in chapter 6, out of the frying pan and into the fire, though that one sticks around. That one survives the revision. But what happens here is that Tolkien immediately revises it, right? It's December of 37, I believe, when he instructs his publisher to change it, and it is not changed until the second edition is published immediately prior to the publication of The Lord of the Rings, becoming If More of Us, which is great, right? Because it is kind of more appropriate within the schematic of Tolkien's world. He's not talking about men, i.e. human beings, he's talking about everyone, but by repositioning it to us, Thorin is also including himself. He's not just talking in the abstract, he's talking about everyone, including him. And it adds to the sense that Thorin has really taken responsibility for his own actions. It's heartbreaking and beautiful and powerful. Brian is pointing out here in the chat that he's not a fan of Bilbo second-guessing his decision with the Arkenstone. I'm fairly certain things would have been much worse if Thorin had the Arkenstone from the start. That is an interesting road down which we can journey at least a little ways, I think. I'm not sure exactly what would have been worse, right? Would battle have begun sooner? Probably. But I'm not even sure about that. Thorin is in ready communication with the army of Dain, and it is possible, we're told that that the army of Dain is familiar with the fact that the men outside of the Lonely Mountain are holding the Arkenstone, which maybe does forestall their assault, and because their assault is forestalled, it allows the eucatastrophe of the goblin army showing up at just the right moment. Had there been less uncertainty, had there been less hesitation, maybe open conflict would have happened between the elves and dwarves and men before the goblins showed up, in which case it would have been disastrous. It would have been a terrible event, one that would be unlikely to be rallied in exactly the way as the Allied forces are rallied by the arrival of the goblins. So I think basically, Brian, that I am with you. I think that what we're getting here from Bilbo is this. Yes, I don't like him second-guessing himself. I'm aligned with you there, but I do see the idea that there was a battle in spite of all your efforts to buy peace and quiet. I suppose you can hardly be blamed for that, right? He kind of comes around to this idea that I really screwed this up. I really messed it up. And I wonder if there's a way in which Bilbo is wishing instead, that what he's really thinking about, the thing that he messed up by taking the Arkenstone and delivering it to the elves and men, and then revealing it to Thorin and being cast out of the mountain, the thing that he is missing is those last moments with Thorin. Had he not taken the Arkenstone, had he not, as Thorin saw it, betrayed the king under the mountain, then he would have been inside the mountain, presumably, as Thorin is either having this final reckoning, this final redemption arc, or not. I don't know if we can say with certainty that if he had possessed the Arkenstone at that point, he would have been more likely or less likely to step off of his obsession with the treasure. We discussed a little last week about even when he is offered the opportunity to buy back the Arkenstone, he hesitates. He doesn't do it. He doesn't start packing up gold and shipping it out to Bard in return for the thing which he says he wants the most. It turns out that what he wants the most in that moment is the hoard en masse. But I think, broadly, I think you're completely right, Brian. I think that Bilbo's having a real moment of doubt there that is not one that I would co-sign. Austin saying here, I don't think without Bilbo taking the Arkenstone, Thorin would have cast off the dragon sickness. I wonder about that. I wonder if it would have acted. I think that there's a way of reading it that would imply very much that the Arkenstone would have been a focal point for Thorin's Thorin's obsession at that point, for Thorin's jealousy. I wonder if it would only have made things worse. Chris chimes in to agree there. Yeah, I think that's a really strong read. Absolutely. Okay, we get the recap then from the narrator's perspective, the events of the battle. The eagles had come, but didn't, crucially, turn the battle, right? If you kind of have the Hobbit living in your head, as most of us do, I'm sure, we can just imagine that the eagles show up and kind of take care of business. That's it. But in fact, we learn that the eagles are outnumbered, that the eagles are losing. It is the arrival of Beorn, the roar of his voice like drums and guns, says the somewhat too modern narrative voice there, that marks the turning point. Beorn then rescues Thorin and carries him back to the mountain before he splits the goblin army in twain and peace is secured. I'm going to have to pick up the pace here just a little bit, so let's move on to burying Thorin and beginning to close off these stories, beginning to really see how these stories come to a very intentional end. Victory had been assured before the fall of night, but the pursuit was still on foot when Bilbo returned to the camp, and not many were in the valleys save the more grievously wounded. "Where are the eagles?" he asked Gandalf that evening as he lay wrapped in many warm blankets. "Some are in the hunt," said the wizard, "but most have gone back to their eyries. They will not stay here and departed with the first light of morning. Dain has crowned their chief with gold and sworn friendship with them forever." "I am sorry. I should have liked to see them again," said Bilbo sleepily. "Perhaps I shall see them on the way home. I suppose I shall be going home soon." "As soon as you like," said the wizard. Actually, it was some days before Bilbo really set out. They buried Thorin deep beneath the mountain, and Bard laid the Arkenstone upon his breast. "There let it lie till the mountain falls," he said. "May it bring good fortune to all his folk that dwell hereafter." Upon his tomb the Elven king then laid Orcrist, the elvish sword that had been taken from Thorin in captivity. It is said in songs that it gleamed ever in the dark if foes approached, and the fortress of the dwarves could not be taken by surprise. There now Dain, son of Nain, took up his abode, and he became king under the mountain, and in time many other dwarves gathered to his throne in the ancient halls. Of the 12 companions of Thorin, 10 remained. Fili and Kili had fallen, defending him with shield and body, for he was their mother's elder brother. The others remained with Dain, for Dain dealt his treasure well. Dain dealt his treasure well. Dain is a good king. Dain is a generous king. He is the prophesied king under the mountain, in fact. We can tell that by the ease with which he gives away the gold immediately, right? The eagles have departed before the dust has even settled from the battle, and in that time, Dain hasn't even really taken charge of the mountain yet, but he has handed over a measure of gold. He has crowned their chief with gold and sworn friendship with them forever. Not just that there is a payment of debt, but there is a bond now. There is a reciprocal bond. There is an alliance here between the dwarves of the Lonely Mountain and the eagles of the Misty Mountains. Austin's calling out here, it's always bothered me that he uses mother's elder brother instead of uncle. I think, and I'm not at all sure about this, I don't quite have the details here at my fingertips to go into it, but I believe that there is a quality of uncleness that is significant in some of the traditions from which Tolkien is drawing, right? Because the open question here, the thing that we really have to consider is why Fili and Kili die. It's not thematic exactly. It's not to mark the end of an era, right? Sometimes you will read the response to this event or these series of events as being the death of the line of Durin. This is where Durin's line dies out. But it's not true. Dain is of the line of Durin, right? Dain's great-grandfather and Thorin's great-grandfather were brothers. So they are very closely tied. They are very closely connected, particularly in a community and a culture where individual lives can last such a long time. So Dain is absolutely of the line of Durin. He's absolutely an appropriate heir to the kingdom under the mountain. What I think we're seeing here is this special bond between uncles and nephews. There is a militaristic kind of connection here in which there is a particular fealty, right? You'll note how the sentence is constructed. Even if you don't know the historic details of this, as I obviously don't know the historic details of this with any kind of depth. This is a momentary recollection of this happening here. But you can see this from the structure of the sentence, right? Fili and Kili had fallen, defending him with shield and body, for he was their mother's elder brother. Because of these things, right? These are not two different facts. These are connected. The reason that they had fallen defending him with shield and body, just to kind of emphasize how how sacrificial it is, how visceral it is. First the shield, then the body itself used to defend the being, the body of Thorin Oakenshield. Their king, yes, but not here their king. Instead, their mother's elder brother. It's an interesting tension there that might account for the necessity, I suppose, of killing off Fili and Kili, though, necessity is a little strong there for sure. We can see the generosity in effect. All of the leaders who remain in this part of the world, the spell of dragon sickness seems to have been completely banished at this point, right? There is no more suggestion that there's any jealousy at all, in fact. Thorin, as he has cast off the dragon sickness by bursting from the gate and going to the aid of his allies, elves, men, and his kin, seems to have shattered the spell completely, to the extent that there is, in fact, a real spell, because everyone is very carefully now being immediately generous. As I say, Dain crowning the King of the Eagles and then dealing with his treasure well enough that everyone else here, all of Thorin's company, choose to remain. Not all of them forever, but that's a story that we'll circle back to in the pages of The Lord of the Rings. I love the detail of the Arkenstone, right? Bilbo has given the Arkenstone to Bard, so it is in some sense his property. We talked before about the fact that Orcrist is in some sense elven property, right? We wondered why Elrond didn't take Orcrist and Glamdring, or at least ask for some kind of payment in kind for these elven blades of Gondolin back when we were at Rivendell. But both parties here, the leader of the men, the leader of the elves, both giving up the token that Thorin has born or kind of been consumed by, been taken by in the course of their conflict here. Austin saying it's thought to be Turgon's sword, right? Yeah, absolutely it is, which is wild. But yes, I believe that is what was born by the King of Gondolin in the Elder Days. I forget the actual quote, but that is, yes, exactly where it is. And there's kind of a chain of speculation that can get you to Glamdring being the sword of Ecthelion, one of Turgon's lieutenants in Gondolin too. But of course, that is just a gesture out to this very veiled legendarium at the point at which Tolkien writes this. He's, as I said before, just kind of copying his own material. He's kind of auto-plagiarizing, I believe is the term that John Ratliff uses. All right. Let's move on to, I'm trying to calculate now just how much time we have and how much more of this we can really do. So let me cover this very quickly. Dain isn't the only one who deals with his treasure well. As we said, we learn that Bard has sent money back to the Master of Lake Town, which I'm sure is going to work out just great. We probably won't have any more story to learn about that guy. And he has given the Emeralds of Girion, quote, such jewels as he most loved, to Thranduil. So we've had this exchange of formal gifts. Bard then famously offers Bilbo his generous reward, though Bilbo, he has this great moment. The fear of war and murder on the return trip seems to daunt Bilbo, which is another one of these moments where we can see, I think, a little incompatibility between the treasure hunt story with which we begin The Hobbit and the fantasy story with which we end The Hobbit. We've talked about this so many times about Thorin arriving at Lake Town and suddenly being king under the mountain returned, right? We move into, we shift our register from fairy tale to fantasy, and then we move into this idea of a returning king story, a pair of returning king stories, in fact, if you fold in Bard too. And through all of this, no one has thought, hey, how are we going to get the treasure out? How are we going to, the first person to bring that up, in fact, as I'm sure you will recall, is Smaug himself, right? How are you going to carry all of this treasure out of this mountain? Because I don't think you are. And now at this point, Bilbo realizes, I don't want it. War and murder will pursue me if I take too much, if I try and carry any share of the wealth back. You'll note, too, that Dain pays Bard the 14th share of the total treasure, which is exactly the arrangement made with Thorin upon the... It is the offer that is made by Thorin upon the ramparts, upon the gate of Erebor there, and Dain holds to that. He seems to be keeping the contract that his cousin has proffered. So Bilbo, in the end, only accepts 2 small chests, which, on the one hand, very modest, very, very, very noble, very fine, very, very appropriate, very, very hobbitish in this moment, though he is also wearing a mithril coat that presumably could buy and sell the entire Shire, and a sword of Gondolin himself, right? He's got all of this equipment. He is still fantastic fantastically wealthy. That's the other detail about the 14th share the Bard takes, of course, is that it's a 14th share. So it's not it's what, 7.5%, however that works out. But it is still greater than any amount of money owned by any of the mortal kings of the realm, right? No one has this much money. It is a fantastic sum of money. So pretty good that Bilbo is modest in his desires to take only 2 small chests, one of silver, one of gold, back to the Shire. Let's take a look at our farewell to the dwarves then. At last the time came for him to say goodbye to his friends. "Farewell, Balin," he said, "and farewell, Dwalin, and farewell, Dori, Nori, Ori, Owen, Glowin, Biffer, Boffer, and Bomber. May your beards never grow thin." And turning towards the mountain, he added, "Farewell, Thorin Oakenshield, and Fili, and Kili. May your memory never fade." Then the dwarves bowed low before their gate, but words stuck in their throats. "Goodbye, and good luck wherever you fare," said Balin at last. "If ever you visit us again when our halls are made fair once more, then the feast shall indeed be splendid." "If ever you're passing my way," said Bilbo, "don't wait to knock. Tea is at 4, but any of you are welcome at any time." Then he turned away. It is November 17th. The Battle of Five Armies happens on November 13th, a month after the dwarves arrive at the Lonely Mountain. It has been, gosh, what is that? 6 months? A whole, full, robust 6 months. 7 months, I guess, even, since Bilbo left the Shire. The renowned Tolkien scholar Tom Shippey, not a Scully called Shipper, Tom Shippey makes a lot in his book, The Road to Middle-earth, about this contrast here between Balin's speech and Bilbo's, right? The one formal and proper and courteous, with the idea that in this moment Balin is even leaning back on old formal rhetorical phrases, right? Words stuck in their throats, and then when Balin does speak, it's in this kind of heightened register. It is appropriate. It's completely fitting the mood of the moment, but it is also very heightened. And then Bilbo responds with exactly the opposite, right? A personal word, encouraging, in fact, the active setting aside of courtesy, where Balin is all very heightened and respectful of the appropriate etiquette for such affairs. Bilbo says, "Don't wait to knock. You don't even have to hesitate. Just walk right into my house no matter what time of day it is. Tea is at 4, but any of you are welcome at any time." The first is this, formal and courteous. The second, personal and enormously warm. And with that, Bilbo leaves the Lonely Mountain. We travel west in the company of Thranduil, who continues to be, by all accounts, a really good dude. It is a little hard coming out of the movie, out of the movies, I should say, out of the Jackson trilogy, to remember that Thranduil is a really good dude, canonically, textually, right there on the page. Good people. We get that for sure. And that Dayan is good people as well. I still find myself sometimes now as I go back to this book being like, I don't trust that Dayan guy. I don't think he's going to be good for the neighborhood. But it turns out, no, in fact, he is a fantastic king. He was absolutely born for this. Yes, as Chris says, you wouldn't know it from the movie. Yeah, exactly. So we then have this moment. This might be our final. Oh, no, we've only got 2 more. We'll finish it up tonight. Finally, we part. We decide that we are going to not travel back through the Mirkwood for very good reasons. Instead, we're going to loop around the northern spur of the Mirkwood, which is not that far because we're pretty close to the northern extremity of Mirkwood anyway, but no one at this point wants to deal with the spiders. And this is the beginning of a set of interesting propositions put forth by the book, that the wild has not been tamed. The problems of the world have not been solved. There is a stability now around the Lonely Mountain, right? Between kind of Mirkwood and, we presume at this point in the story, Lake Town, and whatever will happen to Dale and Erebor itself, that there is a new stability, an alliance, a community that is happening over there. But that doesn't mean that the wild is less wild than it was before, or indeed that Bilbo is any better equipped to handle it, though he is at least here traveling in the company of Gandalf and Beorn, though crucially, even Gandalf and Beorn are like, nah, not the Mirkwood though, kind of done, kind of all fought out for now. We're gonna take the long road home. So then we part. "Farewell, O Elven King," said Gandalf. "Merry be the greenwood while the world is yet young, and merry be all your folk." "Farewell, O Gandalf," said the king. "May you ever appear where you are most needed and least expected. The oftener you appear in my halls, the better I shall be pleased." "I beg of you," said Bilbo, stammering and standing on one foot, "to accept this gift." And he brought out a necklace of silver and pearls that Dayan had given him at their parting. "In what way have I earned such a gift, O Hobbit?" said the king. "Well, I thought, Don't you know, said Bilbo, rather confused, that some little return should be made for your hospitality. I mean, even a burglar has his feelings. I have drunk much of your wine and eaten much of your bread. I will take your gift, O Bilbo the Magnificent, said the king gravely, and I name you elf friend and blessed. May your shadow never grow less, or stealing would be too easy. Farewell. Then the elves turned toward the forest, and Bilbo started on the long road home. Again, Bilbo setting to rights a debt that has been incurred, a debt that the Elven King probably knows about by now, right? He doesn't seem astonished that Bilbo has been a resident in his halls, all unseen for lo those many weeks, but he's probably heard the story of the Ring of Invisibility by now, I'm sure. But nonetheless, Bilbo wants to balance the books. He wants to pay off this debt. He doesn't want to have been a genuine burglar. He wants to be, morally back where he should be. So he does so by regifting this necklace that Dain gave him in the moment of their parting, this necklace of silver and pearls. Chris observes he must have drunk a lot of wine for the price. We don't know how much the Elven King pays for this wine. I mean, I don't know. I also don't know where Dain got this particular necklace. It's, out of a Christmas cracker or something similar, I'm sure. There's this lovely set of all of these debts being repaid, right? Austin saying he is a took. Yes, exactly. There's a quality of valor here, right? There is something heroic about how we settle. I could probably pause to unpick that a little more fully there. There is I'm just now realizing that Austin saying he is a took was in fact a reference to the amount of wine that he drank, which also that, yes, completely true. But there is also a quality of heroism, a quality of valor, I think, that is associated with the paying off of these debts, the ways in which no one now is bearing any ill will, which is, I think, the other thread that we can tie into the necessary death of Fili and Kili, which is simply that Fili and Kili, as Thorin's direct relatives, as Thorin's nephews, would have been in a position where they would be more burdened by the choices made by Thorin during his life, the insults borne by Thorin during his life, the actions taken and the words both said and amended. They would have been more burdened by the aftermath of Thorin's brief ownership of the throne of Erebor than Dain would be, right? Dain can come in and immediately crown the eagles, and it's not complicated. He's just a good guy who's going to do right by the entire region. But there's a slightly different quality to Fili and Kili being there. And of course, the most important thing that happens here, as Thranduil is sparring a little with Bilbo in a scene that I find entirely endearing. I love the "O Bilbo the Magnificent," right? Kind of really teasing Bilbo in language that has been used to describe no less a creature than Smaug himself, right? But the actual beat here, the most important thing that happens in this sequence, this is where Bilbo becomes an elf friend, which is, well, it's not entirely clear. Does Tolkien intend it at this point to be the honorific that it will be later when we are in the Council of Elrond, right? And Elrond rattles off the great and the good of the men of Beleriand who stood with the elves through trial and tribulation, and counts Bilbo among them, and counts by extension Frodo among them, right? Is that what is intended here? Perhaps not, but it is one of those threads that Tolkien picks up when he comes back to The Lord of the Rings and fits these characters back together in their new configuration. Even the touching moment here, I think, between Thranduil and Gandalf is really lovely, honestly. The playfulness of "may you ever appear where you are most needed unless at least expected" is just really, it's very Elrond. It's the most tra-la-la-lolly that we get of any of the elves of Mirkwood. I think we have kind of really repositioned them, and we might speculate too that the reason that Thranduil is just that much nicer now, right? This is not the immediate dispatch of his armed forces to Erebor. This is not the "long will I tarry ere I begin this war for gold," right? It's a different kind of guy, possibly because the dragon sickness has been broken by Thorin. That is a point of speculation, but it is, I believe, a compelling one. Let's quickly get to our final slide of the evening as we decide to winter with Beorn. He had many hardships and adventures before he got back. The wild was still the wild, and there were many other things in it in those days besides goblins. But he was well guided and well guarded. The wizard was with him, and Beorn for much of the way, and he was never in great danger again. Anyway, by midwinter, Gandalf and Bilbo had come all the way back, along both edges of the forest to the doors of Beorn's house, and there for a while they both stayed. Yuletide was warm and merry there, and men came from far and wide to feast at Beorn's bidding. The goblins of the Misty Mountains were now few and terrified and hidden in the deepest holes they could find, and the wargs had vanished from the woods, so that men went abroad without fear. Beorn indeed became a great chief afterwards in those regions and ruled a wide land between the mountains and the wood. And it is said that for many generations the men of his line had the power of taking bears' shape, and some were grim men and bad, but most were in heart like Beorn, if less in size and strength. In their day, the last goblins were hunted from the Misty Mountains, and a new peace came over the edge of the wild. This is, as I say, the end of December. It's taken something like 6 weeks to travel back from Erebor around the northern spur of the Mirkwood all the way back to Beorn's house, just in time for Yuletide, right? Just in time for us to pass this very happy celebration here with Beorn. And if we've had some trouble fitting parts of The Hobbit into the template provided for us by The Lord of the Rings, our sense of the history of this region, the Vales of Anduin here, right, between the mountains and the wood. If we've had some trouble fitting in individual components, this may be the most challenging to our sense of the immediate history of this part of the world as seen from the Council of Elrond in particular, right, as seen from the pages of The Lord of the Rings. The rise of the men, generations of men that are somewhat like Beorn, right? Men here I take to mean humans. Tolkien's capitalization in his other works, particularly by the time that Christopher takes over and collates everything for the Silmarillion, his capitalization of men to mean humans is basically completely consistent, right? Anytime we use the word men to mean human beings, we capitalize it. But that isn't true in the pages of The Hobbit. So I don't know if we are gendering this exactly, or if we are acknowledging that Beorn is a kind of human being who can pass on his skills as a skin changer, who can pass on his shape-changing characteristics. And obviously, as we did with Beorn when we first met him, we are tying here into Old English and Anglo-Saxon traditions of skin changers, of hunters, of a kind of nobility of the wilderness itself. Beorn belongs in the wild, but is still emblematic of civilization, though it is a rougher kind of civilization. Again, see all of our discussions about the time that we spent in Beorn's house the first time around. The hardest part to reconcile here is that the goblins of the Misty Mountains begin our passage here by being few and terrified and hidden in the deepest holes they could find. In their day, though, we learn the Beornings, the people of Beorn, they hunt the last goblins from the Misty Mountains, and a new peace came over the edge of the wild. I don't completely know how to reconcile that with the events of The Lord of the Rings, but we'll circle back to it, I'm sure, in time to come. We will, in fact. Oh, you know what? One concluding thought here. Because this is the end of the chapter. We are now in the spring of the following year. In fact, we are in 2942 of the Third Age. We are in 1342 by Shire reckoning, and we depart from Beorn's house and we return to the Misty Mountains. We conclude this chapter. I didn't pull it on a slide. It is very lovely, but we conclude this chapter with the beat that I used earlier about the positioning of the pass at the highest point of the Misty Mountains, where they were taken by the goblins, in fact, except this time, instead of looking into the west, looking toward home, looking toward Bag End, Bilbo is now looking east. He's still kind of looking behind him in a sense, but he's looking back at the lonely mountain, and he observes that in the end, after fire, there is snow, and even dragons die. We get this brief line right at the end, quote, "The Tookish part was getting very tired, and the Baggins was daily getting stronger," which sets the stage for our final chapter, our final reading from The Hobbit, which we will get to next week. Here is our schedule for the very near future. I teased this a little bit right at the beginning of today's show, but December 23rd, that is next Tuesday evening, we're going to cover Chapter 19, The Last Stage. It's a pretty brief reading. We'll probably do some general thoughts on The Hobbit. We'll probably wrap a few things up. If you guys have any questions, by all means, get in touch in advance, and I can do a little Q&A during that live session too. Why not then? I'm going to take the skip week between Christmas and New Year because I have a lot of reading to do to prepare for whatever our next session is going to be. On January 6th, we're going to take a look at The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey, a film, a motion picture from the year 2012. I am unsure at this point exactly how we're going to approach it. Basically, I'm going to watch this movie within the next couple of days and decide exactly how we're going to chop these things up, whether we're going to split each movie in half. I've bounced that idea around a little bit, but that means that we spend 6 weeks covering movies that maybe we're not completely thrilled by, or we just do extra length episodes through January to spend a little more time discussing this material. We will firm up that schedule once we get closer. But, the other thing to say is that we are also, in that discussion of The Hobbit, because it is a kind of intermediary text, we are also going to be talking about the quest of Erebor from Unfinished Tales. We're going to be looking at the other version of the story of The Hobbit and kind of folding that into our understanding of Jackson's adaptational process. So if you're interested at all in having that extra background, go grab your Unfinished Tales and read up on your quest of Erebor. After that, though, when we're done with The Hobbit, my inclination is to shift from Tolkien's most domestic mode, his most juvenile mode, certainly, to his most fantastical. And this is where you guys come in, because my plan is to study one of the 3 crowning books compiled by Christopher Tolkien, each telling one of his father's great tales. The Children of Húrin from 2007, Beren and Luthien from 2017, or The Fall of Gondolin from 2018. Now, we talked about the Silmarillion versions of these stories fairly recently over on Stars and Swords, my genre fiction podcast, but these collated volumes, these definitive volumes, in effect, are fascinating both as the best versions of these foundational stories, but also as histories of Tolkien's work and progress. My inclination, I will say right up front, is to read these stories chronologically in order of publication. So we would start with the Children of Húrin. We do Húrin and Túrin and Glaurung the Dragon. We do the Fall of Nargothrond and Many an Evil Sword for sure. But I know that some readers, for some reason, find the Children of Húrin to be a little bleak and maybe not completely suited for the early part of the year, when many of you out there, I'm sure, will still have snow on the ground, if not on your eaves over your house. So some might prefer Beren and Luthien, some might prefer The Fall of Gondolin. I propose to put a poll up over on the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword, where you can get links to these live sessions and support me as I continue to make podcasts about Tolkien things basically forever. I'm proposing to put a poll up there so that you guys, the Shire Reckoneers, the Wrecking Crew, can vote exactly on which of these 3 volumes you would like to read and discuss in some depth. They all fall out at about 300 pages. They are all, the Children of Húrin is the longest, but really, it's less than a 10% difference from the other 2 volumes. So I would propose to cover that in maybe 4 to 6 weeks, I would say, depending on the level of complexity, depending on the level of depth that we want to go into, particularly having covered the Silmarillion stories so recently and having those attendant texts kind of available over on the Stars and Swords feed. I'm not completely sure how much more depth we want to go into with these books in particular. And then we'll probably shake it up and do something completely different. Though I have received your emails, I have received your notes of concern. Another trip through the Lord of the Rings is absolutely imminent. Like, I would be surprised if we made it. I would be absolutely astonished, frankly, if we made it out of 2026 without taking a look at The Lord of the Rings in significant depth. And the appendices, which I have actually never covered in a seminar environment. That might be I wonder if there is an interesting way in which you can totally read The Lord of the Rings backwards and just start with the additional material at the end of the book and kind of work your way back in. Probably not the advised approach, but certainly that is on the horizon too, albeit more distantly. That is going to do it for this, the penultimate episode in our Hobbit series, the penultimate episode of the year 2025. I will see you all again back here next week. I'm anticipating 9 p.m. Tuesday evening next week. I do understand that is the day before Christmas Eve, so everyone's schedules are going to be messed up. Everyone is going to be, I'm sure, wearing a Santa hat and probably drinking recreationally at that point. But if you are inclined to join me here, then please do. I wish you all the very best as we part now for another week. But thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for being here, especially Chris and Brian and Austin joining me here live. Oh, Austin's going to be at work next week. That's awful. That oughtn't to be allowed, quite frankly. But we will be thinking of you, Austin, and raising a glass in your honor, I am sure. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, you guys. Thank you to everyone who has been sending me notes of support and encouragement about my failing health over the course of the last week. Back at it, hale and hearty, ready for 2026. Let's go. Thank you all for listening. I'll talk to you all again next week. Until then, take care. Good night, all.